Hi, today I'm going to talk with you about 7 common mistakes you can make when baking with yeast. For example, in making these delicious bread rolls. Hi, I'm Rhiannon, owner of the Epsom Bakehouse, and if you would like more bread making tips, then check out the link below this video and you can sign up to my newsletter. And as a thank you for signing up, you'll also get 3 delicious and simple quick bread recipes that you can bake at home. So do check that out. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about 7 common mistakes that are made when baking with yeast. And in majority this is baking bread like these rolls. And yeast is a really key component of that. If you're making yeasted breads, then the yeast is going to break down the starches of the flour you use, feed on those and produce gas that rises your bread. So you get a delicious roll like this or a beautifully risen loaf of bread. But sometimes it doesn't quite go to plan. So here are 7 common mistakes that can be made and perhaps a little bit more about what you can do instead. So first of all, the yeast might not activate. Now, yeast are actually a lot like us, and they need certain things to help them do that process of producing gas to rise your dough. So common mistakes could be that you've put too hot water in. So with the liquid that you're using for your dough, don't have it any warmer than your hand. Otherwise, your yeast the activity of your yeast may reduce or even stop. Likewise, don't mix your yeast in directly with the salt for your recipe. Again, exposure, if the yeast starts to absorb the salt, for example, once the liquid is added in, then again, that can reduce the activity of your yeast. So step number 1, make sure your yeast are happy and they're going to be active in your dough. Number 2, if you've done all that and your dough is still not rising, then have you checked that your yeast is actually still active, especially if you use dried yeast that you've kept in the cupboard or fridge. If it's been in there for a while, one thing you can do is just have a small amount of water like this and mix in a dash of the yeast and a dash of sugar. Now, I've just done this before starting, so it's not forming bubbles yet. But within about 10 or 15 minutes, if you've done that, a bit of yeast in a little bit of water with a dash of sugar, you should see some bubbles, and that indicates that your yeast is still active. So do that check if your dough is still not rising. Number 3 is allowing your dough to overprove. And what I mean by that is once you've mixed and kneaded your dough, you've left it to rise. Unfortunately, it's risen too much. It's filled up with gas, and actually the yeast have started to run out of food, and your dough then collapses on itself. And again, you're going to make a really dense loaf at that point. The gas is all going to deflate out of it. And conversely, number 4 is not leaving your dough to rise enough. So underproving your dough, not giving your yeast time to fill out. That process does take time, not your time. You can go off and do whatever else you need to do, but do give your dough time to rise and fill out with gas. Give the yeast time to do their thing and let your dough rise so that it produces that light, fluffy bread that you were thinking of. Number 5, getting inconsistent results. So one day this just might work and you turn out a beautiful plate of rolls like this or another bread, and some days it turns out really dense and hard and you can't eat that bread that you've made. Well, first of all, go back to number 2 with your checking your yeast is active, and keep a note of what you do each time you make bread, if you can, when you're still learning, what works in your kitchen. And that helps you adapt your recipe, for example, on a colder day, making sure your dough is warm enough to rise. Number 6, getting a yeasty flavour in your bread. Now, it might seem like if you add in lots and lots of yeast, much more than the recipe calls for, that your dough will rise really well, you'll produce light, fluffy bread. Unfortunately, the downside of that is that your bread will probably have a yeasty flavour. It might not be that pleasant. So go easy on the yeast, make sure you're sticking to what the recipe suggests, and then give your dough time to rise. And then finally, number 7, slow rising in cold weather. So just bearing in mind that your yeast still work at cold temperatures, but it will be more slowly. So if it is a colder day or it's cooler where you're baking your bread, then bear that in mind that the dough will rise much more slowly. Now, you can combat that by putting in water that is tepid, no warmer than your hand, and perhaps give a bit of warmth to your dough. But otherwise, just bear in mind that your dough may not have risen because it just is a bit colder. Let me know if you've ever had any issues when you're baking with yeast at home and you're baking bread. What have you encountered? Let me know in the comments, and whether any of those tips have been helpful, and also what you're loving to bake at home right now. And if you'd like to sign up for the newsletter to get more bread making tips, then you can do that via the link below this video. And I'll be back soon to share some more bread making tips with you, so speak then.